Greetings, friends. Juan Ingruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of November 3rd through November 9th of 2025. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around. I hope you guys are having a wonderful week. And this week, we could probably say that Pokrovsk has fallen. I think if someone said that is true, because the Russians are as you can see on this map, are basically in control of all of Pokrovsk. That being said, there's a difference between Pokrovsk falling and Pokrovsk being secured. So, like, for example, the Russians are pretty much in possession of most of these industrial areas in the northwestern part of Pokrovsk, this area right here. However, as we saw last week, the Ukrainians managed to land a helicopter special forces group here and wanted to enter this gas station, but then they were destroyed by drones. So it's, the thing is that Pokrovsk is mostly secured out, but that doesn't mean that, again, as I don't want to repeat myself every week, but the front line is not solid, as, you might think like, oh, it's 100% either way. It's very fluid, and it's only more solidified the further back you go. So it's like Pokrovsk is basically under complete Russian control. It has fallen for the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians could still probably enter these northern residential suburbs. They could probably, these like northern tips areas. And so Pokrovsk has fallen, but that doesn't mean that it's fully secured for the Russians. They need to push the Ukrainians further back a little bit, but that doesn't mean that a bit further back is that the Russians are solidifying themselves more. For example, we saw there was a video of the Russians setting up something around this area, and being very chill about it. They were out in the open. They weren't like hiding from drones. So obviously, like the more further back you go, kind of probably in the citadel, and everything below the rail line is probably more solidified, because the Ukrainians won't be entering here anytime soon. The Ukrainians try to post a video of them being here, raising a flag, but it could be that this is just another pocket of resistance. Doesn't mean there's like no Ukrainians below the rail line. But these places are being cleared up pretty fast as the Russians pour more and more troops here, and clear out whatever remaining pockets there are, and there's definitely so that's what's happening there in Pokrovsk. So Pokrovsk, we could probably say, has fallen, but we'll see how that. In any case, that's just something to clear in mind. Now, what happened this week was that mostly that the battle for Pokrovsk in the Pokrovsk direction has reached its. Basically, what happened is that the Russians took the rest of Pokrovsk that the Ukrainians were holding down. Specifically, the main area was, I think they call this the Dnipropetrovsk area. This area right here, as you can see, this area is has some high-rise buildings. This was a kind of like the last fortress of Pokrovsk in this northeastern area, and so this week was where the main clashes were happening, and basically the Russians, once they poured into this residential area, started outflanking this area from the north here, and also from the south. We actually had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these positions here, and we actually had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being right in ravine here. So they were on the southern part, so they actually encircled this area, and by the end of this week, the main clashes were going on for the citadel, and now this citadel most mappers are saying the citadel has fallen. But again, there could be some Ukrainian troops left over here, we don't know. But basically, there's no like organized resistance anymore. This was like where the Ukrainians were holding up for this last week, and it was cleared out. So now the Ukrainians have to fall back into now what it's called the Myrnohrad pocket, because as you can see, it is a pocket. There is, it might not be like, as you can see, because these two areas they're just a bunch of open fields. It's very hard for the Russians to put any troops here to physically hold it, but it's just swarming with drones, and it's so small. So for all intents and purposes, it's basically a physical encirclement. But so now what's going to happen is the Russians are going to continue putting the squeeze on Myrnohrad. They're going to probably push the Ukrainians out of the southern part of Myrnohrad, and the Ukrainians will have to do some sort of 360 defense around kind of this area. And as the Russians push from here, they'll push into the northern residential areas here, into the northeastern residential areas here, and just start probably try to take everything above this highway, and then the Russians will be here. So as you can see, then they're gonna, so as you can see, they're gonna just try to squeeze and pop this Myrnohrad pocket, because that's what's gonna happen, and that's gonna, we don't know, now the thing is, there's not like thousands and thousands of troops here. There's probably a couple hundred, but regardless, it's pretty bad news for the Ukrainians that they lost so many troops. Had so many troops captured Myrnohrad. Perhaps they thought they could hold Pokrovsk longer, but Pokrovsk did fall pretty rapidly once the Russians entered it. Also, as mentioned, the Russians are now in Rivnia. They've captured this. It looks like this, like these tubes or some shit. This area right here, and I have no doubts that this Rivnia area will fall very soon. After that, the Russians will continue pushing, along this rail line, and then through this area into the village of Sevilia. The village of Sevilia has a bunch of, just a bunch of residential areas. So with the Russian push also happening from the north here, down here, they're probably going to try to link up here. The main thing is that we also had some more geolocated confirmation of the Russians taking, they call these the pig farms. So it looks like we had some geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these pig farms in the south of Verdinsky here. And such. And actually we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the most northern part of Myrnohrad here. So they were getting droned. So the Russians are operating in this northern sector, and so what I'm betting is that once Ravine is taken, the Russians will continue pushing to Sevilia. The Russians will probably try to take these two kind of like farming complexes, this small area, dacha right here, and then kind of try to link up something like this, have something like this going on, and then try to keep pushing, and then use this northern Myrnohrad area as like a accumulation area to squeeze the rest of the Ukrainians out of the southern part of Myrnohrad. So definitely, it's the Russians have made rapid progress. The Pokrovsk has basically fallen. We also had more geolocated confirmation that the Russians have also taken up positions in these northern dachas right here, and are pushing and taking some of these fields here. Right now, the Ukrainians have their positions around Grishny, and probably are using drones to probably prevent any Russians moving from Pokrovsk towards Grishny to try to take them out. But But besides that, it's going to be I think the Ukrainians have given up trying to push from Grishny to try to unblock it. Every attack they do from here fails. It's very hard to do that. So it looks like attacking from Grishny to try to unblock them is from this area. It has been, has ended in failure. But where I think the Ukrainians are, and I think the reason why they actually haven't pulled out from Myrnohrad is because they delusionally think that they could actually push the Russians completely out of Dnipropetrovsk and out of this area and push them back to the other side of this river right here. They're hoping to push them back to this red line, because if they push them back here, as you can see, then Myrnohrad will be open, and then Myrnohrad can be supplied, and it's not in encirclement anymore. So I think that's why they're keeping them there. And so I think it's a twofold operation. It's first is because they think they can actually unblock Myrnohrad, and second is because I think they're trying to keep the Russians tied down to clear out the couple hundred Ukrainian troops that are in Myrnohrad, so that they could then set up positions around Dnipropetrovsk instead of the Russians pushing and not have the Ukrainians not being ready in time. So I think that's the reason. Now, in terms of Dnipropetrovsk, this is where the Ukrainians are making a lot of rapid progress, or at least have more progress than in most areas. Most sources are now saying that the village is, Kucher Yard over this kind of area where there was like this giant salient has been basically deleted. So the Dnipropetrovsk salient is over. So in terms of like the threat to Dnipropetrovsk, that actually has been removed. That's one thing the Ukrainians could celebrate it. However, in terms of the actual encirclement from in Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, that is still something that the Russians are still in control over. They're still in control of Volodymyrovka and these areas near Panivka, Mayak. They still hold positions around Nikolaevka, Dorishnia, and Zatashok. But this area, and as against this is is very fluid. The Russians could enter Novoshakovo. The Ukrainians could enter Zatashok. So this area kind of is very much a gray zone, and it's very hard for the Ukrainians to accumulate forces because and it's very they have Belitsky, which is where they use their center of operations. But as they move out of Belitsky into these open fields, they become prime targets for Russian counterattacks. So, or from Russian drone attacks. So, they basically deleted this entire salient and. Which helps their positions in Dnipropetrovsk a lot, but they need to do a lot more. They need to basically clear out. If you zoom in here, there's a river, which was served as the main defense line, but the Russians were able to break through it. Here it goes, the Kerensky-Terezk River. This was the Russians were able to break through because of the lack of Ukrainian infantry, and because of that. There's a bunch of trenches here that Russians are using. So the Ukrainians want to push them out of these trenches into the other side of this river, because then, as you can see here, there's nothing here for the Russians, and this would collapse this entire salient, and this would free up Myrnohrad. So this is where the Ukrainians are pushing. So we have to see if they make more progress, if and so forth. So, but right now this is the most biggest kind of area. So where so they're hoping that as the Russians squeeze the Ukrainians out of Myrnohrad, it's like a race against time. Who will be first? Will the Russians squeeze the Ukrainians out of Myrnohrad first, or will the Ukrainians be able to push the Russians out from here entirely? We shall see. But one of the key defenses is Radinsky. We talked about the fall of Radinsky. However, we've seen continuously counterattacks of the Ukrainians managing to enter kind of this most western area. This is actually where the last source of Ukrainian resistance was. This like kind of central, like essentially kind of this area right here, as I mentioned, this kind of area that Syria has in a gray zone. The Ukrainians keep entering here, specifically through this mine. This mine hole is like a bit of a stronghold. The Ukrainians can fortify troops in and then enter. And so, the Russians, since this is so close to the front line, the Ukrainians can't slip into it. As you can see, the front's a lot more fluid than you would think. But anyway, Radinsky is definitely this is an area they want to break Russian control over, and because the fall of Radinsky was what allowed the Russians to actually accumulate to actually encircle Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk from the northern direction. But right now it seems like the Russians are holding on to Radinsky as hard as they can. So, but yeah, the Dnipropetrovsk area, this right here, is where the Ukrainians are pushing. They cleared out kind of the most northern part here in Krucha Yar and the north of Novoshakovo. But then from this area is a bit more of a gray zone, and it's very hard to actually push the Russians completely out. It seems like where the Russians are more kind of in control are like along these like trench networks in this area. So around this area is where there's mostly Russian like control, and then the Russians have mostly control over this kind of central part right here a little bit, but not the Ukrainians could definitely enter here a lot easier. And then everything kind of behind the rail lines more is under full Ukrainian control. And then probably up north here is where right now the Ukrainians are trying to are just in the open fields here, but I don't think the Russians are near Kocher Yar anymore. So we shall see how that develops. So that's the Pokrovsk direction. Now we're going to go to the Dnipropetrovsk direction, and this direction has a lot of big game. And the biggest news from the Dnipropetrovsk direction, or the Glyapolya area, is that the Uspenivka fortified area has fallen. This week we had 100% confirmation that the town of Uspenivka has fallen. This was the main node of Ukrainian resistance along the Yanchura River. And so now that, I was wondering, I'm like, we saw these like villages falling. Like, why don't we see the Russians entering Uspenivka? Like, what's going on? This week we actually had 100%. We had the Russians raising the flags all over Uspenivka. So Uspenivka has fallen. And not only is it this destroys the last fortified area, and now it's just open season towards Glyapolya, it allows the Russians to accumulate forces, which is what's most important as well. And along with this, there's been, we also saw the Russians capture the village of Rabinia, so that was also like one small last piece in this Yanchura River fortified area. So this entire area from Vishana down to Poltavka, this was like where the main axis of the main center of the resistance for the Ukrainians in this area was for the last few, like 2-3 weeks, maybe a month or so. But the Russians have finally broken through this defense line, and now they're pushing towards Glyapolya, and they're not stopping. We had some Russian sources are saying, we don't have any proof of this yet, but a lot of mappers and such, and even pro-Ukrainian sources are admitting this, that the Russians have taken the village of Solodaki here, this village that's a bit more further to the west. Along with this, a lot of sources are saying the Russians are breaking into the villages of Novy and Novouspennivka and are about to capture these two villages. The thing is, if you look at defense lines, there's a bunch of trench networks that kind of flow kind of like this, because they were expecting a direct attack from the south here, but they did not expect an attack from the east here. So they're attacking from the east and kind of throwing the trenches over, and kind of the defenses here are being overrun. So right now it seems like what the Russians are about to do is take Soldovka, Nova, and Novospenivka, and then there's only one kind of last bastion of resistance, which according to some sources the Russians are right on the outskirts of, at least the DRGs, is the village of Romapili. As you can see, it's a small village, but it's considering surrounded by farmland, it's probably pretty easy to probably defend. The Russians have been bombing this place pretty heavily, this will be the last. This is the last place the Ukrainians could try to hold up for try to stop the Russians for a certain amount of time before they could reach Glyapolya. But what the Russians are going to do is take all these villages that are right on the outskirts of Glyapolya, And and the thing about Gallipoli is that it's actually split in half by the river here. What type of river is this? The Hanshura River here. And so there's the northern part of Gallipoli and the southern part. So as you can see, the Hanshura River grows like this. So I actually bet that what the Russians might do is they might just continue pushing southwards and try to take this northern part of Gallipoli. Now, the main center, where there's most of the buildup, is on the southern part of Gallipoli. And so, maybe they'll just, because as you can see, it's not that big of, there's a lot of areas they could cross without there being much of a problem. It seems like a lot of this is just marshland anyway. But they might just do a direct attack. But one thing I think they might also do in tandem from here is probably try to reach, probably take the village of cut the Pokrovsk Gallipoli highway. Now they're so close to it that this highway can no longer be used as the main supply hub to Gallipoli. It'd be good to physically cut it off and then just kind of push southwards as well. There's a river that goes along this area as well, so it kind of protects their flank a little bit. So the Russians could they could push right up to Gallipoli from the east, and then try to maybe start mopping it up from the north here, like this. And so at this point, so if we let's see what this is what I think might happen. Have something like this going on. And so as you can see from this cuts off Gallipoli from the north, it cuts it off from the east, and then the only kind of main, let's kind of change let's go blue, is that the Ukrainians will have to use this area through Zaporizhia here, which will be their lifeline to support themselves, and then get supply from this area right here. So, it'll be like a semi-encirclement. It'll be kind of like Seversk and such like that. But again, I do think the Russians will probably push directly right into Gallipoli and then just probably attack it directly. I don't think they're gonna do I've always underestimated. Maybe I'm a bit more of a cautious planner, offensive planner. I would think okay, take these villages and then maybe start trying to take these villages to the north just to put the squeeze on Gallipoli. But it might be the case that the Russians don't even take these villages before they're already assaulting the northern parts of Gallipoli. The main thing will be how much of an encirclement they could do around Gallipoli, so that the supplies the Ukrainians are going to be flying in through this area gets completely attacked with drones, because this will be kind of the lifeline that Pokrovsk had, but it's it'll be a very shortened line. So any supplies coming in from this direction, there's only one highway into Gallipoli as the Russians enter it from this area. So, and there's a river here. So, this will be droned repeatedly, and I think the main axis for Russian attack will be into Gallipoli. So that's happening there. A bit more to the north here, the Russians have moved a bit more to Elasivka and reached the Volchka River in this area right here. And also they've conquered more of these kind of tree lines that are up to Orstepopol, and some sources are saying the Russians are about to start battling for the village of Orstepopol, because Orstepopol is on the other side of the Volchka River, and the Ukrainians are using that to do a lot of, this is where they're saying oh, the Ukrainians are able to enter Novoselivka or Sonsovka, but I still have not seen any direct proof of that. But taking Orstepopol will allow the Russians to have a foothold to destroy any foothold the Ukrainians have on the other side of the Volchka River, and if they can, maybe start crossing the Volchka River and start battling for Mikhaivka, which could give them another stronghold base on the other side of the Volchka River, just like they did in Ivanovka here. Speaking of that, the village of Ivanovka, we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this kind of northern ravines of Ivanovka, showing that they are actually in Ivanovka. One thing they mentioned is that because about the fluid of the front line is that, for example, the Ukrainian positions in Garlovka, they could do raids into the western part of Ivanovka. So it's, again, just because what it says on the map, it does not mean it's 100% control. It's definitely possible if the Ukrainians, if they want to. It's very risky because, it's well, what's the point? What are they doing to risking themselves getting out of their defensive positions and trying to go across these empty fields to try to enter the western part of Ivanovka? That this exposes them, and they're critically low on infantry, but it is possible. They can't enter Ivanovka because how porous how fluid the front line is on the front line. So but I do think that Ivanovka is still under all Russian control, but it's it's definitely possible for the Ukrainians to enter the western part if they want to. It's just to show it's more fluid. But yeah, Ivanovka, we had more confirmation of the Russians being in Ivanovka. Along with this, most sources have said that more and more of the southern part of Novopavlovka has been taken. We don't have a geolocation of this, But a lot of mappers are saying this, so maybe they have some sources that I don't. But if it is true that the Russians are in the southern part of Novopalovka, this is very bad news because now the Russians go to accumulate here, and they can continue pushing more north. Along with this, even this mapper has admitted that this entire area to between Fili and Dacha has been taken. The Russians are now pushing across the border and taking more of these tree lines, and it seems like the Ukrainians are retreating further and further into Novopalovka. And sooner or later, the southern part of Novopalovka will fall, and then the northern part is like less developed, and the Russians will probably try to take this as well. The main goal probably will be to kind of link up here between Ivanovka and Novopalovka, have a some defense line here, and as you can see from here, then there's nowhere there's no better. The Ukrainians will have to fall back to defensive lines in Mazova in this area, and so if they want to actually go towards Novopalovka and Ivanovka, they'll have to cross these empty fields, which will be droned by Russians. So it's definitely how do you say it? So once Novopalovka and Ivanovka fall, well, Ivanovka has fallen. Once Novopalovka falls, I think there'll be a kind of like a pause here where the Russians have positions in Novopalovka, Ivanovka, and the main Ukrainian positions will be in Mazova along this rail line here. So, and there'll be like this kind of no man's land in the middle here, where very little troops activity happens here. And I think the Russians will be fine with that, though. Alrighty. And then we're going to go to the Zaporizhia direction as well. The main biggest thing here is that we had more and more confirmation the Russians are operating deep into Primorska here. We had more and more geolocation of the Russians clearing Ukrainian positions all over the central part of Primorska here. But again, these are probably more DRGs, and I think that's true. I think there's not like this area. I think the Ukrainians have, as you can see, Primorska becomes an actual kind of more fortified area right along this canal here, and I think the Ukrainians have their best positions there, and the Russians in the southern part of Primorska, in the southern tip here, are where they're more solidified, and then this kind of central part, this kind of elongated part along the Dnieper River, is more of a fluid zone where the Ukrainian forces could enter here, Russian forces could enter, but it's more fluid. But they just show that Primorska, which held the western flank of Stepanhursk, is falling more and more to the Russians. So that is a big gain that's happening for the Russians in the Zaporizhia direction. Alright, now we're going to go to the Kostyantynivka direction, and in this video, or in this area this week, is that the Russians are making some small progress in towards Kostyantynivka. The biggest thing is the Russians are battling for these set of villages, Plishishkia, Ivanopilia, which, as I mentioned last video, are going to allow them to actually accumulate forces to them to be able to supply their contingent that's been operating in this kind of area right here around southern Kostyantynivka here. So the biggest thing that happened this week is that the Russians have completely captured the southern part of Ivanopilia. They have captured these warehouses in Ivanopilia, and so just kind of the most northern and central parts of Ivanopilia are remaining, but I have no doubts that the Russians will probably clear that up very soon. As you can see, it's very hard to actually supply, especially now that the Russians are operating in this area. It's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to try to supply, at least as hard. It's not impossible, but it's harder for the Ukrainians to supply their garrison in Ivanopilia. Especially since it's right on the other side of the river here, so, they'll have to cross the river here. So I do think the Russians will clear up Ivanopilia sometime in November, and the main goal for the Russians is to probably take something like this. Once the Russians have this position going on, this will allow them to then actually funnel troops into this area right here, where the Russians haven't spotted again. I think we had another geolocation, this time a bit more in the southern part around this area near the rail line. So we see the Russians operating very much in this area, and if the Russians could take it, that's probably what the Russian goal is. This will give them a foothold in Kostyantynivka and the ability to resupply it. But then the thing is that the Russians will be attacked from this direction if their flank will be exposed here. Their flank is already exposed in the northern part here, so it's very the assault on Kostyantynivka is a bit premature. I always think that the Russians want to do like a bigger encirclement of Kostyantynivka before they assaulted it, but it seems like they want to have a position here. So and I actually don't really blame them. The thing about this war is that it's kind of flipped. It's what you would think on its head in terms of you want to avoid urban battles, but maybe you don't want to. Maybe you do want to actually have just attack it directly so that your troops could protect themselves from FPV drones and accumulate here. So urban warfare is actually probably in some ways pretty preferable in this war of drones. So maybe instead of like trying to fight in these like villages that are in the north here, which are just like these no-name villages, there's like one or two houses here where they'll be droned out in the fields or attacking here. They just said fuck it, we're just gonna go straight into Konstantinivka. Maybe that would work. Maybe, and considering that there's only, we always see continuously bombardments of Ukraine positions all over here, and considering like, this is like the main, they're not really getting supply from here anyway, and they're not really being supplied from here. These just kind of protect the flanks. The actual supply route is already kind of just a one-way streak. So the Russians basically just have to focus on this area. It's just basically this singular area, and they could basically squeeze the supplies to the supply to Konstantinivka, and they just said, hey, let's just do a direct attack. So, yeah, that might, so we shall see how that develops. Along with this, we had actually a geolocation of the Ukrainians being in this western suburbs of Chasiv Yar, showing that Chasiv Yar is still, again, this just shows the fluidity of the front. This area, the Chasiv Yar has been silent for like a long while, ever since they took it in the summertime. But it does show that it's very much possible for the for the Ukrainians to enter these areas right here. Just because the Russians kick the Ukrainians out doesn't mean they can't re-enter, because this is more of a gray zone. So, definitely, once they took Chasiv Yar, once they had their kind of PR victory, and again, the main thing about Chasiv Yar is that it's on a hilltop, and the biggest hilltop is this area right here, and then it starts, as you go down this way, it gets lower and lower in elevation. But this is where the most fortified area of Chasiv Yar is. So, the Russians are in full control of this area. So, and it's definitely, but these suburbs that are on the western edge of Chasiv Yar, definitely the Ukrainians could infiltrate it. So, they could, but it does show that about the fluidity of the front line. But nothing strategically or operationally like that will harm the Russians in this area, in terms of that Ukraine presence in the most western outskirts of Chasiv Yar. In the Seversk direction, there's actually not been that much big changes. The biggest change is that we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians clearing out. There's like this giant fortifications that are right here, and the Russians are just doing a direct attack. But we had geolocation of the Russians clearing out a trench network right here. We also had geolocation of the Russians last week being here. So it does show the Russians, looks like they're just doing a direct attack onto Seversk. That seems, since there's like so much fields here and there's no like place to accumulate, at least close to Seversk, it's like there's just a bunch of like open fields, and I'm pretty, it's probably pretty hard to accumulate any sort of forces here, and Seversk could hold a lot of Ukrainian troops. So I think the main problem for the Russians is that like bringing troops up here is a very hard task. So so I'm pretty certain that Seversk probably has a very high death rate for the Russians. I think advancing through these fields, advancing directly into Seversk, is pretty hard. So I do think it's a very hard nut to crack. We had more geolocated confirmation that the village of Dnipropetrovsk is under full Russian control, so that's good for the northern sector. We see that the southern part of Seversk is being more and more enveloped. They broke into Zaporizhia last week. We don't know the condition of that, but it looks like their main goal is to try to take the village of Zaporizhia. But again, the main, right now the Russians are just putting more and more of the squeeze on Seversk. But it's what happens in Lyman which will actually determine how the fate of Seversk, basically. But yeah, besides that, there's not been that much more changes in the Seversk direction. Just some more squeezing around the flanks. Speaking of Lyman, there's been no changes actually this week in Lyman. Actually, surprisingly, you would think. There's been no changes on the status of Yampil. We don't know if Stavka has been taken. We don't know the state. We don't know. But yeah, we don't know the extent of like where the Russian positions in this forest are. How much of it is a gray zone? How much of it is under full Russian control? We don't know how much in Dnipropetrovsk is under Russian control. We don't know. The only thing that's been actually changing really the last in November has been this Russian push out of Shenarylikovo and pushing this way towards Alexandrivka and Kostyantynivka Yar. But there's been no real big changes that happened last week. This week there's not really been that much changes here. So yeah, not that much changes in the Lyman direction. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Kupyansk direction, and in the Kupyansk direction, there's actually been a big change, the biggest change. Now, we don't have any geolocations of this, but maybe I haven't seen it, but the biggest thing is that the Russians have completely captured this industrial zone and this kind of high-rise building area in the north eastern part of the city. So this entire city part of Kupiansk has fallen to the Russians, and so now most of Kupyansk is under Russian control. The only big we had more geolocation confirmation of the Russians being the southern part, southwestern part right here. So this shows that the Russians are in control of the southern part here. So along with this, so basically the last thing is that there's some residential areas right here, and this the southern industrial zone is still under kind of Russian Ukraine control. But once this kind of area in this circle right here is taken, then Kupyansk will fall, and then the Russians can accumulate here and then probably start pushing southwards from this direction towards Kupyansk Vasiloya here, which is where the main logistics hub for the Ukrainians in this area. Because the main goal for the Russians is not only to secure Kupyansk, but to destroy this entire salient that's on the other side of the Oskol River here. So take everything behind this red line and secure their area, have Kupyansk be like kind of their big logistics hub on the other side of the Oskol River, so then they could start pushing deep into this area, which I've mentioned in previous videos. But yeah, but the biggest thing is that the Ukrainians know that they know that the Kupyansk is in danger, and they're doing lots of counterattacks to try to stop it. And so there's been a lot, the Ukrainians have been doing a lot of attacks towards Moskova, towards Radivka, trying to basically break through these kind of very, admittedly, very porous logistics lines towards the Oskol River here, and try to cut off the logistics of the Russians in Kupyansk. And so that's probably why the Russians are focusing very heavily on trying to take this eastern part of Kupyansk, so that, if the Ukrainians manage to break through here and cut the logistics here, the Russians could still supply their troops through this area right here. But obviously, I mentioned this, when the Russians were pushing into Kupyansk over the summer. I'm like, hey, you should probably expand your bridgehead here a little bit. Probably try to take Dobrizhev, just kind of push out, in this area, have more breathing space so that your supply lines from Dnipropetrovsk towards Kupyansk is more secure. But it seems like maybe they realize that attacking towards the fields is just a waste of time. Let's just attack directly into Kupyansk and use the city to protect yourself from drones. Again, it's like Kostyantynivka in the sense of you're defending yourself with a how do you say it? It's like with being in an urban area, you protect yourself from drones. While as if you attack these villages, it's very hard. There's not that much areas to support. Hide in. So it's definitely maybe they just thought, hey, fuck, we're just gonna go straight to Kupyansk, and it looks like it worked for them. I was kind of worried when they were stuck in the northern part that'd be cut off, and it seems like the Ukrainians are trying to exploit that by doing counterattacks here, and it's has not worked yet, but it's definitely a big how do you say it? An area that is harmful, that is not as secure for the Russians as you might like. But it does seem like that their direct attack onto Kupyansk allowed them to accumulate forces here and actually take the city. So Kupyansk is about to fall. So that's just something that's big. We talked about the Russians slowly improving their positions in this area around Dnipropetrovsk. It looks like the Russians are improving themselves around Kamyanka, around Boloyivka after they took this last week, and I have no doubts that probably by the end of next week even that they take the village of Doreshia and then push the Ukrainians back to their kind of main kind of defense line around this river here. Around there's like line of villages. So yeah, I have no doubt that Doreshia will probably fall, and then the Ukrainians will fall back here. So right now the Russians are just improving their positions around this area, but just some improvements on the fields. And then in Volchansk is where this is another town, city that is about to fall to the Russians. The biggest news about from this area, and it's kind of Kharkov direction, is that the southern citadel has fallen. We had Russians raising their flags in this area, so it does show that this southern citadel has fallen to the Russians. We don't know if it's like kind of these. We don't know about this area in the most very, very southern, like kind of even outside Volchansk. It's like warehouses area. I bet probably it's like a bit of a gray zone. It's like, the Ukrainians were pushed out, and now it's like, they don't know how to supply themselves here, but maybe the Russians have not cleared it yet. But in any case, this kind of actual central citadel, which was the main defense line for the Russians here in Volchansk, has fallen to the Russians. Along with this, the Russians are now pushing. We have the Russians taking the Volchansk College here. We have the Russians being in this area right here. And right now, it seems like the Russians are taking these areas along this highway. And now, basically, the last thing the Russians need to do is just clear up this southwestern part of Volchansk, or is it southeastern? Southeastern part of Volchansk. This it's just a bunch of residential areas. As you can see, it's not that much stuff. There's not like a citadel here. So and especially since they have control over the northern part here, they could definitely clear up the rest of this area right here, and then say they've completely captured Volchansk. So, yeah, that is one of the biggest news happening from this area, and probably what the Russians will do probably is to continue pushing, probably take Volchansk Kutoroya here, and probably take up everything up to here, take everything here, and then from here, I don't think the Russians will continue pushing this way. They don't want to extend their flank. I think they want to keep the Ukrainians here, and then what they'll do is just kind of hold their positions around, this area like they've been doing in the northern part, and then start pushing around down from the Oskar River. That's my guess. My guess is they'll continue pushing down this way and, continue clearing out these villages in this area. And the thing is that the next biggest Ukrainian line of resistance could be in the village of Belila Kolodasky here, right here. As you can see, it's a pretty decent sized town here. The thing about this area is that, the Russians from Volchansk towards this town will be just in a bunch of open fields. The Russians will be continuously bombed here. So, with this forest, which, even though it's the winter time, it's probably not as, protective, but if the Russians could use Volchansk, they could clear it out by the winter campaign, and then maybe they'll stop. Maybe once they take Volchansk, they'll just use it to accumulate forces. But once they resume attacks, if they do it, they keep attacking anyway. I don't think they'll attack towards Bila Kolodasky. I think they'll attack southwards here. Probably try to take like these villages right here, because then this actually cuts off Bila Kolodasky from supply on this area. And so, as they push southwards here, again, my main thing has always been that the Russians, after they take Kupyansk, will push this way and try to, kind of reach here. As you can see, this allows, and as the Russians push this way and the Russians push this way, this entire northeastern Kharkov direction will be very much in jeopardy. So I think that will be the center of Russian advance after Volchansk falls, which is about to happen. And then there's been no changes in the Sumy direction. So I hope you guys enjoy. Oh yeah, also there's been this massive attack on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, so they're about to be blacked out. It's very, very serious. So we shall, it looks like the Russians are very much putting pressing on the gas to take out Ukrainian energy infrastructure. But I hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian update on what's happening on the ground in the war in Ukraine. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video on. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.